Excellent. So, good evening, everybody. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Dan Dahlberg. I work at BitSight Tech. And as you observed probably through the description, I'm going to be talking predominantly about the BLU Phone issue that you might have read about in the New York Times a few months ago at this point. There's actually two distinct BLU Phone problems, one of which was announced by CryptoWire in the middle of November, and another one that actually we announced 2 days later. I'll be talking in detail about both of those. But just to give you some background on BitSight, kind of what the company's about, what we're doing, and kind of how we relate to this presentation and everything. We're a startup founded in 2011. We're actually located out in the Alewife, in the area of the Alewife Commercial Park. What we're focused on specifically is evaluating cyber risk from an external perspective. And what we do is we aggregate a lot of different data, externally visible data, public data, and we aggregate them down to individual companies. So perhaps you, as say a bank, could get a security rating report on another company if you're sharing data with them or anything like that, so you can see how effective they've actually been at implementing their security posture. So an example of data that we look at, for example, is threat intelligence feeds, right? Those would tell you, for example, when certain computers are infected with malware. And using the fact that, say, this computer is on this network owned by, say, Bank of America, you can then associate that device back to that company, and then other third parties can go and look at that. So it doesn't actually require us having to work with individual companies to generate reports. We can do these from, again, external public data, and it's going to be objective because we treat all these companies the same. And one of the things that we roll it up to is, as I mentioned, is a security rating, so that you can see how one company compares to another from that regard. And to give you a little bit of an idea of my role here at BitSight, I'm a research scientist really focused on our data team. And what that actually means is, I just mentioned our data providers, and what I do is I figure out exactly how we can use that data in our product. What sort of risks does that data reveal about individual companies, ensuring specifically that the data is of high enough quality that we can incorporate it into our product. Because you can imagine that with such a product that we have in place, we can't really deal with any false positives, right? We want to exclude those from our system, just like you don't want false positives showing up in your credit report. That's going to cause you problems when you have to go do various things like get a loan and everything like that. Just to give you an idea of some of the companies that are our customers, we have Bank of America, US Bank, Stryker, Cirrus. They're really all over the map from the different industries that find our data and our product useful from that regard, because one of the things that we did is we pretty much created a new market by allowing people, again, to view security postures of companies and view historical evidence of that as well, that otherwise they wouldn't have available, right? The only way to get this sort of information is through surveys, typically, when companies start working with each other, and there wasn't any actual hard evidence. But that just kind of shows you the breadth of the different industries that we work in. So one of the things I want to preface this talk with is kind of just to give you an idea of somewhat of what we do as well, is I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dyn attack that happened. Not necessarily go into details of like the Mirai botnet and things like that, but really the effects that it actually had on Dyn, the company. And for those of you just unfamiliar with that, I'll give you like a 2-minute overview. It was an issue that happened, in the middle of October. Probably a lot of you were affected, at least to some degree, during the day. And actually, just as a quick survey, I did this at another presentation that I did. How many of you actually were affected because you're trying to access a specific website and it was down for whatever reason? So about like half the room. Okay, I fell into the bucket of actually not even be affected at all. And I was quite surprised when I read by like towards the end of the day or in the middle of the day when people were complaining about services, and I wasn't experiencing any of these. But what Dyn is itself is they're basically a major provider of DNS services, and that DNS, for those unfamiliar, allow you to translate basically a host name into an IP address. So for example, in the case when Dyn was attacked, Dyn's DNS servers were effectively offline, right? And when what's called a recursive DNS server was looking for, say, an IP address of a domain, like where is www.github.com, right? In this case, since the Dyn DNS servers were down, your recursive resolver couldn't find an answer, right? That would then prohibit you from going, in Chrome and browsing the website or checking in code or, doing a git push or anything like that. And in this case, it would just return basically what's known as a serve fail to you, and that resource would be inaccessible. And of course, it wasn't just limited to GitHub. Twitter was affected, I think, Twitter, PayPal, Netflix, through a number of degrees. And one thing that's also important to note, it isn't just the fact that, so in this case, GitHub was inaccessible because GitHub was hosting their domain on Dyn servers, a very straightforward instance. There are also other cases where if a company did what's called a CNAME, and CNAME you can kind of think of as a redirect behavior within the DNS system. So if you had a domain that's CNAMEd into another domain that was hosted on Dyn, you would also have that problem. So just as an explicit example, I'm not quite sure if you can read this as it's a lot of text, but the gist of this is that www.greenhouse.io, for example, is, I think, just a startup out in the Silicon Valley area. And their DNS record CNAMEs to another record. In this case, it's hosted off of Heroku, SSL.com. Greenhouse.io is hosted on some other DNS provider, but Heroku, SSL.com was hosted on Dyn's infrastructure. So in that effect, Greenhouse was also affected, and people couldn't visit their website, right? This is, of course, an example of a lookup when everything was actually functioning. In reality, it would fail right here, right? You would get the first line, but then everything else would be inaccessible. Another one that was actually surprising, it took me a little bit to track down, is one specific subdomain off of AWS was also hosted on Dyn. Specifically, these are the list of the authoritative name servers, as they're called, that answer basically questions for each one of the DNS records you're interested in. And what you can see up top, the first four, basically, that the takeaway is the first four were Dyn, right? That's what the dynect.net domain belongs to. They also, as you can see, had two other providers, UltraDNS and Amazon AWS.com, their actual own, I think Route 53, their own DNS servers. So people who were trying to do anything with compute1.amazon.aws were basically getting intermittent failures from time to time, timeouts particularly, but then eventually your query would work as it hits one of the name servers that was actually functioning. So as we know, why is this particular important, right? Well, the whole attack happened, again, because of Mirai botnet. Mirai botnet manifested itself out of these IoT devices that are simply misconfigured, or not even configured in the first place, or poorly managed. You know, there's a lot of different reasons, mostly because the default username and credentials were just tried on millions and millions of devices and infected all those that worked, right? And once they built that botnet up, they were free to choose whomever victim that they wanted. In case the more popular ones, Dyn, of course, being one, Brian Krebs being another, those services were taken down in the meantime. But getting back to what I kind of wanted to just talk about briefly, how did it actually affect Dyn and some other companies? Well, before the Dyn attack, from a set of about 178,000 domains that we were able to sample that were hosted on Dyn, I've split this up into kind of two parts. One is about 145,000 of these domains exclusively use Dyn as the DNS provider. Meaning, if we went back to that example with AWS, you saw a few of those there, right? In this case, of the domains that we sampled, 145,000 only use Dyn. But in the remaining part, the 33,000, there were more than one authoritative name server DNS provider there, right? But then after the attack, that number quickly diminished. In this case, there were the 139,000 domains that remained exclusive just to Dyn, but importantly, 15,000 or 14,500 domains just completely removed Dyn and completely switched to a different DNS provider right after the attack. I think, yeah, after is as of October 24th, and before was October 20th, and the attack happened, I think, on the 21st. So that just shows you that Dyn lost a pretty good chunk of their customer base because their customer base was affected by this problem. And of course, the remaining bit their share, there's about 25,000 that were using Dyn and another provider. So that the domains in that sample also increased from here. But it just goes to show you how many actual customers have left. One of the things that we can also do is, since we sort of aggregate this data to individual companies, like for example, we know which companies own the particular domains that we're interested in, right? Of course, it could belong to an individual person, like a number of us may own domains, and we wouldn't associate that to anybody because it doesn't belong to a particular corporation. But what we took as, we went to our product and said, okay, for any company that is using Dyn to host a domain, right? What percent of their domains, what percent of all their domains are hosted exclusively on Dyn versus some of them on Dyn? So this is what this actual bar chart is showing you, right? So in this case, the percent of domains on the far left means a company only has basically a handful of domains. A few percent of their domains are hosted on Dyn. But in some other cases, on the far right, 100% of their domains are hosted on Dyn. In this case, you see that there's a big valley here, and there's a small distribution between those two extremes. But of course, the customers that are on the far end of that were, more than just their website might have been affected. It could have been a system that they were using for API access or updates or anything like that. Granted, just the number of domains affected won't necessarily tell you that, but you can see there will probably be a more comprehensive downtime effect with those companies that are exclusively using Dyn for managed DNS services. And what we also done is sort of broke this down by industry. So we classify companies in different ways, what they sell, what they do, and in this case, what you're looking at is a distribution of our industry sectors. And what is pretty much first and foremost is companies in the media and entertainment industry are most likely to be using Dyn and affected by this problem. Right? And a follow-up to that is technology industry. Again, tourism, hospitality kind of tapers off. Government, you would kind of expect to be some of the lowest as they use .gov domains and they have more stringent requirements and things like that. And same with aerospace and defense. But it kind of gives you an idea of some of the breakdown that we can do from that end. And actually, when you view this data in a lot of different ways, from the respective how we categorize these companies, basically more than just by industry sector. So going back to kind of the main topic here, what I want to talk about is, of course, BLU phones. And also, to take another survey, how many of you have a BLU phone or maybe even know someone who uses a BLU phone? All right,
Zach uses one.
What's up?
Zach uses one.
He used to use one. I think we convinced him to move away from having a BLU phone. Yes. So as I mentioned right at the beginning, I'm going to talk actually about two distinct problems. Again, one of them being the New York Times article, and that's actually what I'm going to start with here. The takeaway a lot of people probably have is that, from this particular article, that a company called AdUps Technologies was basically siphoning away data from your phone, right, and then sending that back out to China at some frequency, right? And basically the biggest phone manufacturer in the U.S. that was affected by this was BLU. And they said at the time that 120,000 of its phones had been affected. Based upon some of the other stuff I'll tell you later, I'm not quite sure I personally believe that, but that might be the case. And to give you kind of a breakdown of what actually was happening is that, for those not familiar actually with some of the technical pieces of that, is that this was first spotted by somebody at CryptoWire who bought one of Amazon's Amazon's BLU phone, because they had launched, I think sometime in August or so, they launched the Amazon BLU R1 for like $50 that you can buy on Amazon.com. And this person had bought it and was sort of doing his own personal due diligence and monitoring traffic that was coming out of the device, figuring out where it was going, and he noticed that there was these suspicious payloads basically getting sent to an IP in China at a pretty regular basis. So at that point, he went and inspected it and figured out what was going on. So to kind of give you a breakdown, again, every 72 hours, these specifically call logs and SMS messages that were sent and received, of course, on the device were packaged up, basically converted into JSON format, zipped, desencrypted with the secret key not crack, which I'm using, and the IV of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then just posted to this URL that they were using, bigdata.adups.com. And at least from this researcher's perspective, that's all that was really happening with this binary, in terms of it didn't seem to be adversely affecting the device in any other way in terms of pushing down applications or perhaps managing advertisements or anything like that was on the phone. It was purely collecting this set of information and shipping it back off.
Hey, Dan, question.
Yeah.
Are those the phones that Amazon was subsidizing? Like you get the ads and whatever and get a reduced price of the phone?
Amazon did have the Fire phone, but I don't know if they also did a subsidized model for the BLU R1. And also, everyone feel free to ask questions too throughout this presentation if you got any as I go through. Yeah, so who is that? What is AdUps? Who is AdUps? As I just mentioned, the actual operating name of the company is Shanghai AdUps Technologies Corporation. I'll just summarize it as AdUps. What they primarily do is offer basically firmware over the air kind of a product line. Basically, companies who work with AdUps in terms of managing remote devices and doing everything like that. So if you're, for example, looking at their website and looking at the primary features, you would see things called an app push service in terms of perhaps managing the applications on the device. You need package checking, mobile advertising, and of course, as we just observed, device data mining, and includes not just information about the particular device and any sort of heuristics about it, but of course the user as well. And CryptoWire actually did a kind of a more detailed breakdown of at least some components that they looked at about this binary, right? And it can do SMS recording, transmission, IMEI, IMSI, exfiltration, call logs that we just spoke about, can gather your contacts, location collection, command injection, remote user application update, etc. Kind of your run-of-the-mill stuff that you typically also don't want to be exposed, right? You don't want other people knowing this information on your phone. Your phone is a very private device. And one of the more, and one thing to mention too is one of the more interesting aspects of the binary is that it was also able to selectively choose messages based upon certain strings of text. So if there were a certain set of keywords that maybe somebody was interested in on your device for messages, they could be selectively collected and then sent back up. So it wouldn't just be, it could just be a broad collection like it was doing, or it could have been more narrow if they choose to have done it that way, rather than just kind of bulk collect everything. And what I really enjoy about the response from this company is that it says AddUps has claimed that it was mistakenly installed on phones sold in the US and that the version had been created for a Chinese OEM selling devices domestically. So basically, it wasn't like a bug, it was just, we installed this on the wrong set of phones. That's the unfortunate part of what happened. And of course, what they ended up doing with BLU is they updated the binary. They deployed a new version, provided it to BLU, that had this feature disabled. So it actually, from what I can remember from their kind of remediation instructions, it's still present on the device, but it isn't doing this behavior in terms of periodically and automatically sending back this information back to China. Yeah, and another thing that they mentioned is that they claimed that this functionality was added in around June of 2016. I do caveat it immediately because of some information I'll talk about later. And that, yeah, so I just explained that they shipped an update through its firmware updating service to disable the spying functionality, as quoted by Krebs. So who are they? Well, this byline is right on their website. And it says, we are dedicated to be the world's leading IoT device management cloud platform. And to be fair, they are trying to do that, but for anybody that, anybody creating such a product, whether or not it's a phone, or again, it could be any other embedded device, through due diligence, these issues could be exposed. So it isn't just an issue like, for example, in the Mirai case where people could argue whether or not it's on the onus of the device manufacturer to make sure that the devices could be shipped and configured in a good and well-known state, or it's up to the user through a well-defined workflow to put it in that state, and whatever. In this case, it's actually the IoT manufacturer, the person supposed to be managing these embedded devices, are not doing things correctly. So it's at an entirely sort of different level from that standpoint. And actually, this is a little bit more of an expanded version. So as I mentioned, they're a FOIA provider doing end-to-end device management. Again, this is a quote directly from their website, but it's more of the marketing material that allows you to kind of give perhaps a better idea of their target demographic. Yeah, smart devices continually smarter and better to meet high expectations. So that's pretty much a quick summary of the AddUps issue that was first announced in November. And one of the things I want to talk about is another issue that we identified with BLU phones. Technically, we identified it early in the year, but it was announced shortly after this past issue here. So to kind of give you a little bit of a background, as I mentioned earlier when I was describing our product, we have different sort of many different forms of data that kind of go into our security ratings report that we produce, one of which is threat intelligence. And again, that's kind of, you can summarize that really abstractly in terms of we're just identifying computers infected with malware or potentially unwanted applications on the internet. Historically, this data was pretty much exclusively used by companies that wanted to say block, they were looking to maybe say on their email appliance, block the ability for these computers to send an email because they may be likely of sending spam, for example. So they were used by individual companies to help protect that company. But then when we started to use it, we wanted to start associating this information, these data points, back to the individual companies that may be originating the bad traffic, right, originating the malware. So one method of doing threat intelligence gathering is a method known as sinkholing. And what sinkhole means is you basically try to either identify and basically sort of like listen in on malware communication back to the attacker. So for example, if an attacker or hacker wrote a piece of malware, installed it on a computer, one thing that they're of course always interested in doing is be able to retain communication with it, right? They don't want to infect your computer and just run off, run away. Otherwise, what's the point of infecting your computer to begin with? So there's some return on investment that they want. And they do this through what's known as a command and control infrastructure, right? Your computer will check in to the what's known as, again, a C2 server as well, and the malware author will send it a command. Your computer will do whatever command that is, maybe get your banking credentials or mine some Bitcoin, right? And then respond with some result back to the C2 server. And sinkholing means somehow being able to sort of disrupt or intercept some of these communications. So a lot of malware uses what's known as a domain generation algorithm, like they generate new domains every day that the attacker can register, and threat intelligence companies will register some of those so they'll be able to intercept and distinguish where some of these infected computers are. It's kind of a very brief overview of just what it's about, but another point to make is sometimes a lot of unrelated things just end up in this bucket, right? Sometimes you'll register domains that are just misconfigured by a company and they're really like maybe the internal proxy provisioning domain or something like that. Like there's a lot of weird and ambiguous things that can crop up from time to time, or just domains that expired like in mobile applications or an old API, things like that. So again, it's kind of oftentimes it's often hard to disambiguate those cases because even though a domain that may get registered and analyzed may not be necessarily malicious, it may be still sending sort of what you would think is personal information, for example. So in this case, we registered 2 domains and we start getting basically requests or payloads that looked exactly like this, basically, with some redacted information to protect this particular case. As you see, it's just a JSON payload with a couple of important pieces of information that I bolded, the UDID of the device, basically the software version, the model as the device reported, IMEI, phone numbers in case it was a dual SIM phone, and the country name. And what you could just take away here is that this is just reporting a bunch of device information for seemingly an odd reason. Here's another example, same syntax, of course. On this case, the model is a BLU Studio G, but same information is carried over. In this case, the country name also is in the United States. So one of the first things that we did is we plotted kind of where all these devices were originating. This is a very common process when you're doing threat intelligence research, right? You want to figure out where, and you see these very similar maps sometimes when people are talking about a botnet. Okay, where does the botnet live? And in this case, what you first recognize is that United States, Mexico, Malaysia over there, and kind of Brazil are the most prominent countries where this mobile malware possibly is originating from. But for people who've done sort of investigations into mobile malware before, this is a very unusual distribution because a lot of the mobile malware is coming in East Asia. So for a lot of the different botnets, it's actually very focused in, say, China. Or in reality, it's going to be focused against like a population distribution. And in this case, there's no check-ins coming from China. A good number coming from India, but in this case, the United States is predominantly the main factor here. So that was very unusual. That was the first thing, sort of a red flag for us when looking into this, in that it may not have been necessarily malware. So then what we did is we plotted, okay, what are all these distinct device models that are coming in? In some cases, as you're looking through these, they're quite ambiguous in terms of, I don't know what an X3 is or an X6. There could be multiple manufacturers that produce these, but some of these are very readable, right? You see a BLU Studio G right at the top that makes up 27% of this model distribution here. Then Infinix is I believe, the Brazilian manufacturer, and it kind of goes on and tapers off from there. This has actually changed quite a bit. There's a number of additional Aqua devices that I think have taken the top role, and that is a device manufacturer, I believe, based out of, or at least devices targeted in India, if I recall correctly. But at least for the most part, BLU is still one of the top, or was one of the top actors here.
Question?
Yep.
So to remind me that you're able to get this information because you were able to anticipate a domain name that they would use and register it before they could register it?
Basically, that's how it would typically work in a traditional malware sense, And I'll talk about what we kind of explicitly did in this case in a moment in terms of like what domains that we were able to register and things like that. And it'll kind of give you a better picture of how we're actually collecting this information. But in general, that's how one would go about doing it.
Right, but if, for example, if they have a communication already set up with their servers, you can't interrupt that. You're having to sort of take advantage of that time gap where you figured something out, and you don't want to register all of them because so they know it's failing. But
correct. Yep. Yeah. So there's a lot of cases in just again this sort of market where there could be a well-established botnet that the malware author has complete control over. And you can't really use this technique to be able to observe its size or anything like that. In cases where, historically, what would happen is, say, back in the early 2000s or late 90s, malware authors would say use a single domain, right, and provision their malware to contact a single host name, right, like bobsburgers.com or something like that. But what would happen at that point is the authorities would quickly just take the domain away from them, and then the botnet would just sit idle and do nothing, and the botnet would effectively be taken out at that point. So what a lot of malware authors did as of recently, which kind of in effect benefited people in this space, is that they rotated domains on a frequent basis, and you can sort of predict domains into the future. So you're able to pick these up and register them, and thus start being able to capture them. There's of course command and control infrastructures, models that don't allow you to be able to see into them, like malware that uses Tor, for example. It's very hard, obviously, at that point to identify the actual endpoints, the IP addresses of the endpoints to do this sort of analysis from that standpoint. There's also malware that uses peer-to-peer networks, but in that case, you can actually basically craft or create a sort of simulator that can actually crawl a peer-to-peer network, so you can gather information that way. But I'll talk more about this specific case in a few minutes. And here's just another view at it. It's just the course of I think a few days in July when I just had plotted this data, and that it's slowly incrementing as you would expect as some of these devices get purchased. It's well after, in some cases, the BLU Studio G I think was first introduced in the November of 2015, if I recall correctly. But it's relatively stable. You don't see a lot of phones dropping off at this point in time. And I think I had just chose a sample of devices just to give you a good distribution. And some are really only in there, like 1,000 near at the bottom, and some are upwards of, in case of BLU Studio G, I think it was 280,000 distinct devices over this period. So, as I just mentioned, the geographic distribution and just the device information in general seems a bit more unusual, right? And again, with malware that's targeted towards mobile applications, you don't really have this sort of signal with mobile devices. It's kind of just this huge swath of different device models over a whole cross of different manufacturers. So the first thing that we thought is, okay, are these devices compromised out of the box? So of course, what did we do? We went to Best Buy and picked up a phone. So in this case, again, this was a BLU Studio G. It was for sale actually in the store as well for $80. So we grabbed this device. And the first thing that I did is I set up a basically network environment that allowed me to easily intercept all this device traffic on the wireless network so that I can then go back and analyze it. And of course, one of the first things it does, again, a little hard to read, but it does a query on one of the domains I'll talk about, but the most important part of it, the takeaway here, is that it's doing an HTTP post for a JSON syntax that, again, looks quite familiar. So you see it has C registrant, it has a whole bunch of the same JSON schema that I showed you a moment ago being posted to that particular header. And then after sort of starting to trace that, I immediately found a set of particular binaries that was responsible for this traffic. And the name of the binary was interestingly named debugs, with a particular just MD5 hash. And it's the binary that I'll be talking about for the rest of this. There was two other ones that were of interest. One that just seemed like basically the one that is deployed if they want to self-update it. So actually, I think debugs back would get written when they deploy a new version, and then when it restarts, it's restored and then executed. And debugs run is basically just a wrapper service for the top binary here. So yeah, the devices were, what I noticed as well is the devices were basically checking in every 10 minutes. We observed that from our data that we were receiving, and I was seeing that on my device as well. So what's the actual behavior that's happening here? Like what happened to my phone when I first started it up, and then when that communication went out? So when the device first boots up, one of the things this binary does is it fires off what's known as an Android intent for any other applications on the phone that are listening to be able to act on it, right? So there's two applications that do listen for this particular intent. One was Android Debug Spin. Another one was MTK Audio Assistant. I didn't get a chance to look into specifically what MTK Audio Assistant does, but it seemed very peculiar that this particular binary would be interested in listening for this intent. I think at this point there's more information about what this binary is. I forget the company that did publish some of this information, and I can't recall exactly what it is offhand. But either way, it's not specific to, I think, if I recall correctly now, I think they utilize this application to help do some specific data gathering. But either way, after it fires off this intent, it starts actually bootstrapping up a SQLite database where it's storing some of its information that it's either collecting or just other statistics. But it writes this database into a file in system bin, system bin, unint 8int, which of course is a very unusual name and location for a SQLite database to begin with. But it throws in some device and state information in there, including the pre-configured headends that we were able to, one, register a couple of them, and two, and I'll show you that in a second. And then it enters basically into this waiting routine where it's waiting to hear back. This slide basically just shows is some of the assembly or decompiled code that basically just says, it's going through and it's trying to fire off that JSON payload. It checks the response, and if it doesn't get a valid one, it basically just sleeps for 10 minutes and goes back to a waiting state. What are those headends? So going back to that gentleman's earlier topic, right? There's 3 domains that were pre-programmed into this binary. The first of which was registered by the company responsible for this binary, which I'll speak to in a bit. But these last 2 were ones that were not registered at the time, right? And through some of the techniques that we use just through threat intelligence and sinkholing, these were identified as being suspicious domains, and we had registered them. So for some reason, the person who created this binary, shipped it, did not decide to register those 2 domains, which left this obviously a pretty big issue open for anybody else who had noticed this, could have picked those up. And then pretty much, as you will see, pretty much get control over all these different devices. So the next thing I, of course, wanted to know is, what does this actually do? Like, why is it sending off these payloads? What can it get back? At that point, at the time I was looking into this, I didn't know the specifics about the earlier BLU Phone issue, because this was quite a few months before that other one was announced. But either way, I obviously wanted to know. And one of the first things that stands out, if you can read the comments here, is this last one that says push commands down at the bottom, right? Some of the other ones, push link, push text, push client, push config, but that caught my attention pretty quick and kind of wanted to realize what it did. So here's another breakdown where I just had done some very rudimentary exploration of some of the other ones. Push config just does local updates, so they can actually push new headends if they wanted to into the device for whatever reason. However, if for some reason that device needs to get bootstrapped again, like if it gets, if Android resets it, or someone basically cleans up the user space and whatnot, those changes would get lost and just get reset back to the standard 3. But this still allows it to update the headends in the local SQLite database. Push client, I believe, is used for basically that earlier self-update mechanism I was talking about. Push APK installs an arbitrary APK, and push commands, is the interest point here. So what's, at this point, it's also noteworthy is that since we actually knew what the real headend was, right, we had registered the 2 domains, we knew what the other one was, we never saw any response that came back from that particular headend. It would always, the client would always send its request JSON, and it would come back with immediate reset. It would just say, stop talking to me, right? And I tried at some point going on, to another computer and tried, either changing the user agent, changing other aspects of the request to try to solicit different responses back from the headend, but it just dropped the request every single time. So at this point, what I basically just had to do was start reversing the different data structures within this binary to come up with what would be the JSON response here. So this is just an example of what would be the response coming back from that headend if it did send it. In this case, specific to, though, a push commands action. So in this case, it's really just saying you got a code that I believe specified when the action took place, either immediately or delayed for some reason. The name of the action, of course, and just some details about it. And the commands, even though it's plural, it's just a single command, in this case I just wrote RMRF, but that's where you specify what you want to do. And these other two, title and comments, that went into the SQLite database. I don't know when those would have been exposed. It could have been just during one of the other actions where it can gather just log or metrics about what has happened on the device over time. So now that we know what comes back, we just, at that point, wanted to build a proof of concept. Can I man in the middle this attack? As because one of the things that you might have noticed from that capture that I showed you, the packet capture, that was not over SSL, that was over plain text HTTP. So could I man in the middle this phone, and once I do that, can I then intercept one of these requests and send back my own response, right? Not from our infrastructure that we're collecting the other data that I showed you early on, but just from my local network, right? From this computer, actually. And there's a number of ways you can perform man-in-the-middle attacks. There's a couple techniques known as ARP storms, where you just try to pretend to be your local gateway through confusing a lot of the other devices on your network to keep this abstract. The other one being DHCP racing, where you attempt to either be, say, the gateway, or what I ended up choosing is basically just trying to be the local network's DNS resolver, because I really didn't want to deal with intercepting all the traffic that the device might send out, say, to Google or any other software that might have been installed. I just really just wanted, as I mentioned here, just intercept the request to the defined domains that we know about, and then give back an answer that points to my laptop rather than points back to the actual handheld. So at that point, I just had to, once I was able to man in the middle of the device, I just had to create a basic web server, since it's all over HTTP, that responded in the way that the device would happily accept it. And that's what I was actually able to do. So in this case, this is just a screenshot from a local Python application that I wrote, just simply using HTTP server that would then, what you see here is the incoming request that's the same schema as represented before. And in this case, I just pushed back a command that was basically running the touch command into a privileged directory. So in this case, it's running touch in data system and with the file name system read write test, basically. And this is a privileged directory that basically only root has write access to. In this case, the client seemed to have happily accepted it and closed the connection. And then when I connected the phone to my computer and ran ADB shell, I can then interact on a shell with the phone to observe, okay, what actually happened here. In this case, I confirmed that, hey, this file that I told it to write was written to data system with the privilege of root, and I confirmed down here too that I couldn't, just as a normal user, be able to echo, or create another file within this directory, because again, I wouldn't have permissions to do that. So I confirmed that you could man in the middle of this device and just execute whatever command you wanted as root. So I just already spoke about, so what's the attack surface? Well, anybody that is in a privileged position, maybe on the same Wi-Fi network, open Wi-Fi network, that can do these sort of attacks would again be able to sort of do whatever they wanted on your phone, because there's no integrity check of this channel, right? This OTA channel or control channel, and it's clear that that it's poorly implemented. But the next set of questions were like, okay, there's a lot of mistakes here, and there's a lot of suspicious things, but what's actually going on, right? We saw the database name was in a very, in a very weird location with a very weird name. But one of the things that we also noticed is that the binary is actually trying to mask itself on the phone. It was trying to hide itself. So for those of you familiar with Linux, probably familiar with the top and PS command. And what we noticed is that the code has actually changed to explicitly hide down here, hide the presence of that binary basically when you ran those commands. So basically, it skipped over those processes when you ran PS or top and pretended that they didn't exist, right? So you get output that those would not be present on. Another thing that we noticed is that in the Java util class, same thing sort of happened, right? As it iterated over specific processings, if it matched debugs run or debugs, it didn't exist as well, right? I think in this case, there's another one that with a specific process ID, I think would basically set force as well. But again, there's attempts at trying to mask its presence. We were able to easily sort of tell, it was obviously running by one, again, looking at netstat and seeing these transactions going out, but if you just iterate over proc, you can see the actual running processes. If you do that manually, you can sort of figure out what's actually actively running and everything. So what is this binary? Just like the earlier conversation we just had, what is ADAPS and what is that binary? So this exhibits behavior of an OTA mechanism. If you look at those setup commands, they sort of similarly match to what ADAPS functionality are. And this actually is all associated to a company called Raglan Tech. which I'll speak about in the next slide, I think. So it provides, one of the other things is that provides actions that could possibly make its presence known to the user, like a push notification or pushing a link or something like that. Obviously, that would not be something that would be user initiated. Whether or not that contains enough material for the user to understand what's going on, probably not. But it does, do user activity. It's not just purely trying to hide. It does make active attempts to hide itself, although it does do it poorly and doesn't do it completely. So for example, on one of the on that blue phone that we noticed, even though this code, for example, showed that was hiding the debugs binary, both debugs and debugs run, what I ended up noticing is that debugs run was getting hidden, but debugs was not. And this is likely what I could contribute to this is the firmware that we got this particular code from was from one of the other affected devices, and the one that was on the blue phone might have just been out of date or something that caused that sort of quote-unquote bug, I guess, to happen that caused its presence just to be observed. There's other cases where, again, if you iterate over proc, you still see it running. It's named debugs, which seems like an odd thing, like that stands out to any sort of person that's doing due diligence as a suspicious name. Right, so whatever the binary basically is, the reported issue that we took upon ourselves, it really only covers the lack of integrity in the transactions, because again, it opens users up to attack to adversaries on their local network, or really anybody in the line of communication. So what is RAG&Tech? That actually is still an interesting open question. What we can make out of it from our own investigation, they're based out of China, so there's not a lot of English material for us to work with, but they perform a lot of consulting and services for different device manufacturers. And I believe they actually manufacture their own set of devices. So whether or not they're actually the manufacturer for BLU devices, or BLU just assists them in terms of managing these devices or writing, like preparing the system image and things like that, it's unclear. They were not, BLU did not reveal that sort of information about the extent of RAG&Tech's relationship with them. But they really are trying to strive, as you can see here. This is, again, just taken right from their website, which I think is ragandtech.com, but I would probably Google that first. So going to the disclosure process, we successfully reached out to BLU about this problem earlier in April, and I provided technical details about this particular issue, shortly thereafter to them. But I was not able to contact any of the other manufacturers, right? So there's a whole host of different phones that you observed. BLU was the only one that we were able to make contact with.
So they're based in Florida.
What's up?
Because they're based in Florida.
Right, they're based in Florida. They're the only manufacturer, at least out of their affected device model list, that were based in the United States, from what we can tell. And so our next step, of course, was reach out to CERT, and CERT provides this sort of communication link between organizations that find vulnerabilities and the device manufacturers, things like that. We reached out to them about after a month and a half of not being able to make contact. They weren't able to make contact with any of the other device manufacturers as well. And at this point, CERT assigned the CVE number and created a knowledge base number and basically made that information public in November. And just to give you an idea of the things that we were able to identify, not able to identify, this is just another view of that same pie chart I showed you earlier, but sort of abstracting it out to the device manufacturer. So as you can see, BLU matches about the same rough, number of devices that would have been affected. Infinix, device manufacturers that I had never heard of before, Doogie, Legio, and Exulo, but the remaining, like almost 50%, were just devices that were too ambiguous for us to make a strong association back to a particular manufacturer, right? Like X3 or X6. Well, there's a lot of different manufacturers who have that same model number, and we, without going and systematically buying all these devices, we could clearly state that, oh, hey, this device manufacturer is affected, while another one is not. So very similar to the Dyn.
The only lead you had was what you were capturing on your.
Correct. So actually, what made this particular issue a little bit interesting is we actually had sort of data on the number of devices and what devices were affected by this. In the case of the previous ADAPS issue, it was really just what ADAPS stated was affected, right? Because they're the ones that provided the 120,000 devices affected on BLU particularly. But we were going back to the sort of threat intelligence component. We were receiving all these check-ins for all the devices all around the world. So that allowed us to compile this sort of information.
Can you remind us how you first found out about this?
Yep, so this, I mean, going back to the list of domains here, these domains basically,
No, before you knew, you got that from your phone, right?
we observed these being, yes, communicated on the phone, correct.
So how did you first spot the possible problem before you bought the blue phone?
Through this. So for example, it's kind of hard to explain without just going into really detail about, some of it's like intellectual property at the same time, but a lot of it's just through sinkholing.
Okay.
Basically, through the ways that we go and find interesting and/or malicious domains, it could be through reversing malware, but there's other indicators that in either way these domains clearly cropped up on and went through our process, and we registered them to start looking at the types of traffic that were coming back. So we started with the domains here, realized the devices that were affected, and that's when we picked up the phone, confirmed that that was actually occurring, and then the rest goes through here.
So after you set up those head-ends basically and started getting the data, that's when you made the connection to the handsets.
Correct. That's when we were able to say, and thankfully because they were clearly stating which device, handset models were in there. And actually a lot of Android malware does that. They'll report basic heuristics so that malware author will know that information too. They want to know what they infected, so they'll include some of that simple information in there too. But because of its presence, we were able to make the progress that we were able to make.
Yeah.
Because it was just ambiguous, we would have these 3 million endpoints that were reporting to us, just like a large botnet, but we would have no idea what was actually happening from that standpoint. And by buying the phone, allowing us to actually get the code and reverse it, allowed us to figure out the stuff. So this is very similar to a graphic that we showed with Dyn, just basically looking at all the companies that actually had these phones on their network, right? And this is the distribution of those industry sectors that had these devices. Whether or not it could be on a guest net, it could be actually on the corporate network. There's a variety of different ways. The first one right up top that kind of stands out, of course, is education, and that sort of makes sense, being that education is often a very open network for students to be able to use. There's a lot of, pretty much there's no restrictions on the BYOD policy at an educational institution. A lot of students just bring whatever they want. And then it kind of goes down. One of the surprising things is healthcare, and then goes down to tourism. One of the things that does show up here at about like 4.5% is government. But it's a good, there's about 75% or so of the industry sectors are basically in the top 8, right? Of the devices present on the network are in the top 8 there.
And you said 3 million endpoints, unique
correct,
endpoints?
3 million devices that we had observed at the time that I created this presentation, which was about a month ago or so.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and I'll include additional material that you can go read more about this too if you want. And one of the other interesting things is when I was looking at this in April, there was actually more than just this particular issue that stood out to me on the phone, but just because of other things, I didn't have time to investigate. One of the things here that you'll see, right, this is another endpoint that was sending information up to a different head end that was very similar. In this case, we didn't actually control the domains, right? We didn't have any sort of telemetry on the affected phones. This was just another thing I noticed when observing network traffic, basically, on the blue phone that was getting sent up to different head ends. And it contains very similar information in terms of the model number, the product, the IMEI, the MAC address, the network operator, the SIM, the language. But in this case, it was formatting it a little bit differently, but in either case, it was to the same thing. But in my report that I wrote to Blue, I included this information because, again, this shouldn't be exposed externally. I had no idea what it did either. So this is a screenshot of some of the, from the part of my report that I did send up to Blue. But one of the things that you might end up noticing is that I tied the particular domain that was sending this information back up to Adams. So what I had likely observed was that actual same binary that CryptoWire had picked up on the Amazon Blue R1, which is why I had earlier prefaced or noted that the number that Adams had stated, about 120,000 different phones, that was actually probably specifically the Amazon Blue R1 phones, just not the entire portfolio of different Blue phones affected. That could have just been like a lost in translation moment or something like that, or just wasn't specific enough. Either way, I did include this information. When the other Adams issue was announced, I tried reaching back up to Blue to confirm whether or not this that I had found, and there's more details than just this section here, was related to that, but they did not respond. So this is kind of just give you just a timeline. So in this case, on November 15th, the New York Times article that I displayed was announced, and then 2 days later, we announced something through Ars Technica, basically that the backdoor was found on 3 million Android phones, also BLU phones, and then something that actually happened this past month for some reason is that someone realized that the AddUps malware, in quotes, was shipped on the Nook 7, the Barnes & Noble Nook 7. And it just took, I think it was actually a reporter for the Linux Journal that noticed this problem. Oh yeah, you
I wrote about it. Yeah. He bought one of these. It was a low-cost Nook. It was like a $50 Nook, and plugged it in, and I think noticed that the AddUps name came up. Yeah, when
correct.
He was doing the firmware update after he took it out of the box.
Yep. Yeah. The Barnes & Noble. So Barnes & Noble used to actually sell a branded Nook. I think quite a few years ago that anyone who stepped into Barnes & Noble would have noticed. And then a couple of years ago, they basically stopped producing those. And the substitute for it was basically Samsung tablets that had a Nook application pre-installed. Right, so they had partnered with Samsung to basically have that model. But then again, recently they relaunched a set of Nook branded devices. I forget when they did it. It was sometime in the middle of this year, but it took. You would think that given this recent announcement by CryptoWire, someone at Barnes & Noble hopefully would have gone and checked their devices, but they did not. And I'm sure the number of affected devices that the AddUps issue is present on is more than just these sets, given the number of companies AddUps actually ends up working with. Because in the original CryptoWire article, it stated basically all the different companies that AddUps had relationships with, including like ZTE. Although ZTE then made a later statement saying none of their devices that they work with AddUps on were affected by this particular problem. So it's still ambiguous what devices have this particular problem on it, but 1 month later, it was still being found. So yeah, just as a quick summary, CryptoWire, your takeaway there is one that basically can siphon off all your SMS messages, contacts, installed apps, and sent to China on a regular cadence. The one that we announced is anyone who has the ability to perform a man-in-the-middle attack can just execute anything on your phone. And both those issues affect a good number of the BLU phone models. Ours wasn't just isolated because we had the telemetry, we were able to see the device models again. It isn't just limited to the Studio G, even though it stood out quite prominently. It does affect more phones, and we list them on the CERT knowledge base article that I mentioned earlier. And that's about it. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you just talk a little bit about how, like, if you were going to man in the middle, some people can do this, like, what approach you would take?
Yeah. So one of the you sort of have to be in a privileged position to be able to perform man in the middle attack, right? Because you have to be capable of being in between the device that you want to target and the destination for which you'll be sending traffic, right? And the easiest way to do that is kind of be on either extremes, either one of those extremes. You can be closer to the device which is sending traffic around the internet, or you can be close to the destination if that's where you want to target, basically all devices talking to that host. In this case, that would either mean you would want to perform a man-in-the-middle attack close to the server in China, which is not very practical, or in reality, you want to do it close to the phone. And a more effective way of doing that is, since it's a phone, it's going to be likely to be joining wireless networks, right? And if you're down in like a Starbucks or anything, like a hotspot, an Xfinity hotspot, anything like that, that's an open wireless network. Other users that join that network will be in the same, basically, broadcast network. And it will be in that privileged position that they can use the techniques that I just demonstrated to you before to start intercepting your traffic. This is man-in-the-middle attack is such a prominent problem that this is why a prominent problem, at least historically or potentially, is one of the reasons why there's a big push to make everything on the internet SSL, HTTPS, right? Protect not only the ability for someone to intercept it and maybe manipulate the traffic like we're doing here or could do here, but expose maybe sensitive information about what you're doing, right? So another way, exactly, yeah. And so once you're able to get in that privileged position, man in the middle, you just then as you can see, it's a very simple approach to create a simulated headend that can just return a response that can execute a command on your phone that you want. I'll start from over there.
Any guesses why? So they went to all this trouble and yet they did not use SSL?
Correct. So what he asked is they went through all this trouble and they did not use SSL. That was a mystery to us. They made attempts, going back to trying to hide it, but then they didn't bother using SSL to try to not only maybe protect the integrity of the transaction, but maybe even lock it down to a particular set of headends, right? One way that you could effectively do that is in the binary itself. You can limit communication to a headend that only has a specific certificate, also known as certificate pinning. A lot of websites, like Google, for example, actually do this because there's, as we have seen in the past few years, there's been people who've been able to create valid certificates for real websites that otherwise should not have. So even malware authors sometimes use certificate pinning to make sure that they only talk to that server, but they didn't do that as well. So there's a lot of faults along the way, but it still was pretty ambiguous exactly what it was doing as well. I think you had a question?
Yeah. So the receiver of all this data, could they use that data to go and send a command to all the devices that they just now mined?
Yeah, the Rag'nTech host that I had pointed out, basically the owner of that original domain could issue commands to all these phones at once if they wanted to. We could as well. We're not going to do that. And threat intelligence companies in general, because of the way they gather their telemetry, sort of have control over these botnets that they find and detect, right, to some degree, because they're seeing these requests come in. But threat intelligence companies should not be in the sort of position to try to issue commands to these devices because they have no idea what they are. It could be industrial control systems that threat intelligence company might try to want to fix, like remove whatever affected thing is on the server, but then crash it, right? So that you can often have more negative effects by trying to push a command or something, or try to fix an issue that's open. But yes, basically that host in China.
In the middle to do the command. The database that's created there is full of endpoints that you could issue commands to.
Correct. By default, it only has 3 domains configured, one of which is controlled by Rag'nTech, and the other 2 which is controlled by our threat intelligence company.
And Dan, if I'm recalling the slide correctly, there was another command that would have allowed you to push down an APK, like an application, a mobile application to these devices as well. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. So an attacker could
unsigned, no authentication by the user. You could just basically push a program down.
I mean, on that, I'm not quite sure whether or not, if it does any code signing checks or anything along those lines. I mean, based upon what I found with it so far, I would be shocked if it actually did the whole installing an APK correctly and verify the integrity of the application, the developer cert that was signed with, and all that fun stuff. I'd be surprised if it does do that. Actually, briefly going back to his earlier question, one of the things an attacker can do as well, instead of immediately executing a command on your phone, as you can see with the push config command that I talked about, they can just make a small update to the database on the phone, and then at that point, they're guaranteeing that your phone is going to be talking to them at all times in the future. Right, so they can push a new set of headends to your phone, and then they can track you perhaps and ask your phone obviously any other questions or exfiltrate any other data.
So you cannot possibly stop exfiltration of the data.
Sorry, say that again?
Is there any other way to stop exfiltration of the data?
So BLU has pushed out an update to address this issue. So if you did have an affected phone, you could install the update that would prevent this from happening. But from a user's standpoint, there's nothing really that they could effectively do. Like if you're technologically competent, you could force this. You can basically remove this binary on your phone. But for the recourse for a normal user to help mitigate it, with the BLU Phone, they either have to install the update, but if they're using any of the other 75% of the affected device models, they don't have the ability to address this at the moment.
And what ability, most of what you learned from kind of observing both the data that you were getting in and then the phone. If you want to go to the next level, actually reverse engineer the binary itself, that is is that something you could have done as well?
That's what I started doing basically in order for me to figure out what it did, and specifically the schema that basically the control channel used for me to be able to issue that command. So I did reverse a small part of the binary to find that information out that allowed me to figure out what that attacked surface was.
But there are still some black box components of the software, of the firmware itself.
Oh yeah, the binary does do a lot of different things. There could be more capabilities that I was not aware of with that binary. It's just at the time that's only what I've been able to investigate out of it. If that answers your question.
It does.
Okay. Anyone have any other questions? No?
Thank you. Just kind of thinking through the forensic analysis that you folks did. I mean, the intent is clearly there, right? I mean, there's something going on. It's just interesting how poorly done
Yes.
it is, right? I mean, even sort of the happenstance that those domain names weren't registered, which afforded you the opportunity to do all things that you did. I mean, how often do you find these types of systems that are, that there is intent, but it's actually just poorly executed? Is it just a bad hacking community in that case, or I guess the question is, how often do you find such poorly executed type of things like this?
Right. It's relatively rare that we run into a situation like this, or we capture this sort of control channel. That was very unusual for us, which is why it was very particular interest for me to figure out, okay, how did we do this, and what is it, and like, how do we even get here in the first place? So that traditionally doesn't happen. I mean, there's certainly a lot of malware authors out there that could do a lot better job, right, at trying to protect their own resources to prevent us from even finding it to begin with. So in reality, there's a lot of improvements that that community could make to better protect themselves. That's a weird thing to say, but for this sort of thing, where it's sort of like ambiguous on what it is in the first place, there were very limited times that we've been able to observe such a situation like this, so it's kind of hard to answer from that side. I mean, anecdotally, from everyone's experiences with just different computing systems and IoT devices, there's a lot of egregious mistakes that you shouldn't have found or experienced in the first place, and this is, unfortunately, another iteration of that. Yes.
So, you probably remember this better than me, but it seems like 10 to 15 years ago, some of our mainline cell phone carriers were shipping phones with instrumentation packages.
Carrier IQ.
Can you do any linkage between that and this? I mean, it appears they may have also had an engineering purpose here that might have been along that line.
Yeah. I know one thing that's very similar to that. I don't know if it was about 10 years ago or so, but Carrier IQ was
that was one.
Yeah, as some people can imagine. That was very similar to the ADAPS issue,
right,
and sort of similar to the Raketech one too. And actually, in CryptoWire's announcement, when they were talking about the ADAPS binary, they related it very much against Carrier IQ. One of the things that actually included in their report was a breakdown of Carrier IQ's feature list and ADAPS feature list to try to drive home the point that this thing is performing a lot of actions that users would technically usually not agree with and don't want that information exposed. We didn't provide a similar matrix. We were more or less wanting to get the problem of opening up this, closing the attack surface that we presented here, right? So just arbitrary people couldn't take over your phones. In the ADAPS binary case, people couldn't do that. Like they weren't, they didn't have the same integrity problem of their control channel like Raketech did. Ultimately, if we invested more time into the specifics of the binary, maybe we could have come up with a very similar matrix. One thing that I had forgotten that I just remembered too, that so as you can see with all the evidence that we presented here, it was very hard to come to one conclusion or another, whether or not it was legitimate or if it was actually malicious, right? And we sort of are leaning on the ends of that it was legitimate in the sense it was supposed to be there. Whether or not some actor in the background might have been using it for malicious purposes for whatever reason, obviously that's open for interpretation. But It wasn't hiding itself well. And through our conversations with BLU, there was nothing during those conversations that they seemed to have alluded to, like, oh, wow, like they were surprised that the presence of this or something like that was a surprise to them or anything like that. So that made us believe that, it wasn't somehow inadvertently put there by someone outside the supply chain, I guess is a better way to phrase it. Obviously, there's a lot of information here to process, and it's sort of a debate going one way or another, but I forgot to mention that data point.
Do you recall, did Carrier IQ also hide itself from top? And I have some recollection that it did.
I can't remember if it went to that much detail in terms of explicitly hiding itself like that. That was obviously one of the more unusual things about this particular problem, was the level of detail and lack of detail at the same time that it did to hide itself. It seemed like someone maybe went down that route to try to hide itself and then gave up after like a few days and like, oh well, and kind of left like half the pieces in place and then decided to say, forget about it.
Did like a couple Google searches on like how to hide, a process name or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Clicked a couple links.
Probably, yeah.
I'd like to compare the Carrier IQ binary to this one.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a very
Maybe
interesting
some
thing.
linkage.
Yeah, I would definitely have to read up again on the specifics of that Carrier IQ, on the Carrier IQ problem, I guess.
Well, they're clearly very, even if they're not the same code base, that would be surprising, but they're clearly serving the same business purpose, right?
Yeah, I would say that's probably accurate in terms
Right.
of the collection of information that either the device manufacturer or someone would be interested in.
Right. And as cybersecurity experts will tell you, again, in this whole, well, if they're bad guys, why are they so careless? Criminals are only as clever as they need to be to accomplish their end. So if we don't require them to be super stealthy and sophisticated, then they are. And by and large, they are, because the bar to compromise any organization is actually quite low. Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry. If you started with the assumption that this was some sort of debugging tool, could you really explain all the features that it had?
I mean, that's, given the name of the binary, that's one conclusion you can immediately come to, that someone was maybe developed this and installed it on phones during their development processes or building the system image or anything like that, and somehow inadvertently left it there. But through conversations that I kind of mentioned before with BLU, and the fact that it tried to hide itself,
Well,
typically you're not trying to hide your own debugging utilities on the
hiding
phone.
could make sense if you didn't want some other application that was looking at things to be affected by seeing the debugging. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. That could be a possibility in terms of they're trying to make it as seamless into the system as possible, such that any other reporting or metrics they might be doing aren't adversely affected by this additional binary that they're using for debugging purposes. We couldn't get a clear answer from BLU also on like, hey, what is this? So we couldn't come to that definitive conclusion too.
I'm sure that whoever it was who did this, even if it was legitimate, they'd be really embarrassed to give any details given
Right.
letting it out.
Probably. Yeah.
I mean, we've had previous discussions in this meetup about software supply chain security and how most of the software that gets included in IoT devices is full of known CVEs and everything else. And to me, this is just another example of not truly understanding the software that's being included in your device. Maybe you get a discount of 10 cents per license if you include this software, and that's what drives its adoption. And if you're a manufacturer like BLU, where the retail price of a phone is $50, I don't know how they make any money. Maybe they make up in volume. I don't know.
I worked for a company like that once.
Well, I mean, and also I think the other thing that's sort of emerging from all these cases, and I'm doing a little bit of research right now on a story, came out from Pen Test Partners in the UK that found this dump of date-specific master passwords for DVRs, and it was from this Chinese vendor. Actually, the firmware vendor was Zhang Mai, who was the firmware vendor for all the cameras that got owned in the Mirai botnet, right? So they also make DVRs. So there was this list of master passwords that were date specific, but of course the problem with date specific passwords is that you need some kind of a sheet that people can reference to know what the password is. Your text, or remember you're distributing these to, you've got to somehow distribute the passwords to them. So they had this PDF of all of his passwords for 2017 that somehow ended up on LinkedIn, grabbed by the Google bot, and next thing you know, Ken Monroe and pen test partners found it and was saying, oh, this is great. But when you start Googling on some of the unique password values in the password list, right, it turns out that there are a whole bunch of other DVRs from different vendors that that use the same password list, different bezels, the whole bit. So then it's like the same question, which is, what's going on? Is this Zhongmai OEMing its firmware to a whole bunch, or is Zhongmai making all these different DVRs and just putting different bezels on them? Or are different DVR makers in China pirating the Zhongmai firmware because they just use the same chipset, and so let's just take their firmware and it's 90% done, and we'll change a few features and make the UI look different.
Yeah.
And by the way, grab their master password list too. It's really unclear, and like you said, you can't get a response from any of these companies either because of language barrier, or because of cultural barrier. They're not used to reporters calling up and being like, "Please explain to me how you do business." But these devices are sold all over the world, including into the U.S. These small kind of local companies in a region that might do closed circuit, cameras and stuff like that, will resell these devices into the U.S., into India, into Hong Kong, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it is. It's kind of a. It's kind of almost like a food systems problem. Like the bad sausage gets made, and then next thing you know, it's like all over the country. It's like that type of thing.
Yeah.
But it's global. So there is this question of like, what's going on? And my sense, just kind of writing about this, is there's always a level of plausible deniability. Like, may well not be malicious. It certainly isn't high quality. Maybe they want this data for diagnostic purposes, whereas in the U.S. we're thinking more about surveillance and privacy and stuff like that. There might be a legitimate business or maintenance reason for some of this data they're collecting. But especially in the context of countries like China, you might have other parties who are interested in that data for other reasons.
Yep, and there's definitely companies in Rag Tech, very much possibly seems like one where they'll provide a lot of the standard services in terms of manufacturing a device for a company and just customize and brand it the way that company wants.
Right.
And for some cases, for some of BLU's phones, maybe the lower cost models, that may be the approach that they've taken here. And then all those related phone models that were affected could have been under that umbrella of taking advantage of different services these companies offer to some degree. And then, of course, they can distribute it around the world, and other device manufacturers or brand names jump on board.
And the problem is, as with Zhongmai, when the security problem comes up, whether it's the hard-coded administrator password or the trivial cross-site scripting vulnerability or whatever, the set of devices from that manufacturer that are positively identified with that vulnerability is short, whereas the list of actually really affected devices could be much longer. And it's very hard to know who all those downstream customers are.
Correct.
Yeah. So cleaning this stuff up gets really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, we were definitely in the kind of the unique position to be able to see the telemetry on those affected models, and there's a lot. As you see, 50% of the phones, we have no idea what they are.
Yeah.
The ability to find them, and it could be a whole, there could be another 40 different manufacturers in that collection of phones that we just won't be able to associate.
That's crazy.
Anything else?
Question? No.
So that's pretty scary in and of itself.
Yeah.
But we have, we have Internet of Things, and that's vulnerable in its own unique, special, fun ways.
Yep.
And now we see how phones can be. As phones become not just phones, but as phones become devices as part identification, authentication, and authorization, that strikes me as it gets even scarier, because now this thing which is supposed to be not just sort of private, but also becomes an important part of my authentication process, might be compromisable. And I'm sure you have to look at the details of whatever is going on in there, but there may be modules that can be compromised, or aspects of the operating system that can be compromised. To take something like FIDO and make it essentially non-functional because it's just software somewhere that one of these things can compromise.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, as the number of like IoT devices and different kinds of IoT devices proliferate around the world, the chain to protect different processes like authentication or anything like that could be compromised themselves, such that it reveals a whole host of different other risks involved. Because if a device like that is for some reason affected, that opens the door to a whole number of completely unrelated systems potentially that an attacker could gain advantage of.
So this is my first time, I think, at this particular meetup. I'm glad to hear that supply chain issues have come up.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not surprising. But, you know, is that something that the device world is really making progress and grappling with?
I don't think so. They're grappling with it. I'm not sure. I think one of the problems is that, again, just my perspective writing about it and covering the space is that, the IoT market is really just a market, and it responds to the same stimulus as other markets. And right now, the stimulus is around time to market and low cost per unit, right? So it's very easy to just go to China and source stuff there and get your device, whatever that is, made up quickly. I think my guess is, and we have gentlemen here from Philips, and so I think companies increasingly are aware that have brands to protect, are aware of the fact of, like, hold on, we've got to make sure that we're doing security right. We've got to make sure that we're sourcing components well, software and hardware.
Layer and layer and layer.
So they're pushing back. My guess is they're pushing control further down into the supply chain. But there are, as that pie chart indicated, for every Philips there are 10 or 20 vendors and competing in the same space with competing products who simply don't care. And their products could end up, Home Depot or Best Buy or any of these vendors. So.
I mean, even a Philips is including code.
I'm using Philips, it's really unfair, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, but like any major vendor, like they're including code most likely that's not theirs and they don't
Sure.
understand.
Yeah, open source at the very least, if not, third party proprietary code. Yeah. And my sense is there's a lot more due diligence. Again, large manufacturers, companies with brands to protect, there is more audits and more assessments of those third party, both open source and closed source components. It's starting to happen, but
Having worked for a very large manufacturer in the past, I would not make that assumption. The trouble is that you have large development teams, and there are too many developers who go, oh, I can fix this little problem by including this other package, and I can get my task done on time. And nobody knows about the package until 2 years later somebody does an audit.
That's right. And I know for a fact that, for example, like Home Depot has a whole line of smart home products, connected light switches and stuff, kind of like the Belkin type products. Those are using that Espressif kind of IoT in a box package. It's really almost like a hobbyist level IoT package, highly secure out of the box. But that's the guts of those Home Depot sockets and switches and stuff like that. Is basically a hobbyist IoT kit.
Yeah, and you don't know who's writing the code. Like Philip actually has written a bunch of the firmware for those 8266s that are powering those. So the manufacturers don't know Philip. They don't know the quality of the code that he writes.
Yeah. We should talk. It's a great example. It's short answer to your question is I think there's a dawning awareness that there's accountability, your brand's kind of on the line, and if you care about that, then you need to start looking downstream a little bit more. You can't just close your eyes and cross your fingers and hope for the best. But I don't think that much, for most companies out there making IoT devices, that there's that much awareness yet. In this room, there is. Other questions for Dan? Let's give him a big hand. Thank you. That was really. Can we find your slides online? Let me anticipate their.
I don't have them posted anywhere at the moment, but if you are interested, yeah, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or anything like that, or email me. I can send you a copy, or I'll reach out back out to Paul and you can host them somewhere too.
That sounds good. If you are okay sharing with them, just let me know and I'll post them on the website.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any other questions or agenda items?
I just want to mention that we are hiring at BitSight on all teams, so if you're interested and want to know more, come chat with us. There are 4 of us here tonight, so we're glad
Plenty
to
of people to talk to. Yes, great company, great location. You take the red line right to work and walk there.
Yep.
Okay, and as I said, webinar tomorrow afternoon. I do have a couple spots left at a lunch on Thursday. If you're a CXO/senior IT person or interested, you can let me know. We will be getting the agenda up for February. RSA is in the middle of the month, so I'm going to be out of town, but I think third week of the month, it should be third Tuesday of the month again, back here, same dot time, same dot channel. And other than that, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
I didn't want to say this out loud. Doesn't it definitely flight to Chinese government?